All right. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome to the second episode of Dismantling the Ivory Tower podcast. I am Elijah John, your host. I'm joined today and every day by Dr. Clifford C. Meeks. How you doing, Doc?
I'm all right. I don't know if you're going to be joined by me every day, but...
Every single day. Every day. No matter where I am.
You know, I do got a day job, too, so...
Yeah. So, this is a big episode. Actually, we recorded an interview with Dr. Adrien Bennings, the president of PCC. We did that, a couple weeks ago now, but we're going to be segueing to that a little later. That'll be kind of the back half of this episode. So we're excited for everybody to see that.
Yeah. Sure. Welcome, everyone. Episode 2. So excited to continue this endeavor with my fellow student and alumnus of the Men of Color Leadership Program, Elijah Yan. And so
John. It's John.
That's right.
I'm
gonna get your name right.
It's all right.
Eventually.
It's like nobody gets it. It's like Vine with a J. I always get. Is it Jagney? Is it Jane? Is it? Yeah, I've had some weird pronunciation. Yan is honestly the closest that anybody's ever gotten. So, I'm
still not gonna take that as a compliment, brother, because you know where I stand with names.
Fair enough.
Names are important. So. If I'm not getting it right, I don't have to tell you that. I've already told you this, but if I'm not getting it right, I need to be, then please don't hesitate to correct me. So,
right.
But no, definitely welcome to our audience, second episode of the podcast. And as you said, we had a great interview with Dr. Bennings, who for our audience, for context for our audience, is the still fairly new president here at Portland Community College. She just came on in July, and so she's kind of hit the ground running, as they say. But so far, at least from the conversation we had with her, it appeared that she's acclimating pretty well to not just the environment here at PCC, but also just Portland in general. So I think when our audience hears that interview, they'll get more context as to who she is. But I think also, more importantly, it was interesting to determine what her own definition of the Ivory Tower is.
Absolutely. And I think we're going to expand upon that a little bit today, because we went over it last episode, but I think you had some more you wanted to share as well, yeah?
Yeah, I think one of the things, and I mean, having having been in the program and sharing with you and the rest of your cohort some of my own background, I consider myself a bit of an amateur historian, and so I like to kind of look into the context of things and how things came about. And so, after we did the first episode, and just in general, when we were brainstorming on this endeavor, the Ivory Tower is a phrase that I've always heard, and it seems like many people have heard. But as we started, manifesting this into the reality, questions started coming up with, okay, so where did this phrase even come from?
Yeah, what is it? What does it mean? Yeah,
like, exactly. how did this even come about?
And is it something that, is the Ivory Tower specifically, speaking about academia?
Right.
I've had, that was actually a question I got. It was, is Ivory Tower, could that be all kinds of parts of society? Is that just academia? So there is a little bit, I think, of confusion just on what that is in the general sphere. So I think it's important to kind of elaborate upon that.
Yeah. And I did. I'm going to forward you this article I came across by Stephen Chapin, who is a professor of history of science at Harvard University.
Okay.
He actually wrote an article titled "The Ivory Tower: History of a Figure of Speech and Its Cultural Uses."
Oh, interesting.
Yeah, and I've been I've been dismantling the article, pun intended. So I've been dismantling his article, but it's very fascinating that he starts out by saying, there never was this ivory tower in terms of like a literal,
right, a physical representation.
Sure. You know, and the very next sentence at the start of his article is, it was always a figure of speech. And so that's essentially what we are, you know, dismantling or even unpacking.
It's an idea.
Yeah, this idea or this figure of speech. But as I've read through a good portion of the article, I still have a few pages left, but that figure of speech has morphed over time, you know, and for me, you know, he starts back to, you know, period of antiquity. He even cites some biblical references, not necessarily to like an ivory tower, but I remember growing up learning about the Tower of Babel and how that was something built to
house knowledge, is that right?
Well, house knowledge, but also kind of a way to try and travel up to the heavens, if you will. And, you know, and it was interesting, you know, how even in that period, like towers were designed, and I'm kind of paraphrasing some of his text, but towers, at least in periods of antiquity, were designed as these mountains, man-made mountains, if you want to call it that, kind of reaching up into the heavens, reaching up into, you know, what some might call the imaginative or the creative space. You know, and kind of a way of, you know, being in space that allows one to disengage, you know, from what's perceived as the reality.
Sure.
And from there, I've just been like, wow, okay, you know, contrasting that part to our own, and when I say my references and your references, because both of our references are a little similar in the context of academia, you know, juxtaposing the antiquity, you know, the antiquated, you know, context with our modern day context. To me, it's already exposing, oh, wow, the way it was thought about back then and the way it's thought about now, it's like on opposite ends of the spectrum.
Yeah.
And so it's kind of fascinating as I'm continuing to unpack this, as to learn how the figure of speech, quote unquote, the ivory tower, as a figure of speech, has morphed over the years. And it really came to more prominence, more so in the 20s and the 30s, you know, and it wasn't even associated with academia.
Okay.
Honestly,
I didn't know that. Expand upon that, because I'm interested to know, like, where did it come from? What was it talking about?
Yeah, it was actually, at least according to Professor Chapin, you know, it started out as, you know, it started out as a way to really in the realm of art.
Okay.
And literature, you know, the arts and literature. And it was kind of this space where I guess, and I'm definitely going off of his text, but I am interpreting it as a space where one went to contemplate and then produce, you know, the art. And so, but what kept coming up for me was this, what is perceived as a bit of a negative connotation, because the ivory tower, and here's what I mean, Elijah, the reason why I'm perceiving it as a negative connotation is because it was, at least in this antiquated context, the ivory tower was perceived as a way for one to disengage from the reality and not kind of deal with the reality of struggle, with the reality of.
So you kind of sitting up in your ivory tower. You got all the cares.
Yeah.
You don't care about them anymore. It's like you're up in your tower. Nothing else matters.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. You're kind of sitting up there, and you're not really worried about the struggles of your fellow humankind.
Maybe even looking down on them from your.
To some extent, yeah. I even got that connotation as well. It's like, oh wow, in some sense, this ivory tower is one in which folks are peering over and saying, oh, that's what y'all are dealing with.
Yeah.
Okay,
right.
I'll check in with y'all later on.
Yeah.
So,
and it's interesting because I think that almost even ties into our modern day. We kind of have these. Nowadays, it's not an ivory tower; it's a skyscraper. And that's. But it is like in a non academia setting. That ivory tower is a skyscraper, and there are people who are looking down and up there, no cares, and it's very much like up in the penthouse. New York City. I think that's a real thing though, that exists now, and then I guess as well.
Yeah. And so I think, having, the other context I think I've been getting as I'm continuing to read, and in some instances reread certain passages, is that, here it is, you have one who retreats to their ivory tower, and, but more importantly, okay, once they say they come out of it and they choose to re-engage, with society, then what is the product? And again, we're speaking in terms of this was used primarily in in literary circles and artistic circles. So that what is the product that's being produced, and is that relevant and cogent to the society's current reality?
Sure.
And so, oftentimes it was, I think largely that's up for debate. But again, the perception I got was that it's not, the product was not anywhere near what the reality was for the people, if that makes sense.
Right.
And in some instances, we can kind of see that in today's context. If we take it out of the realm of academia, what we see happening is certain folks, who've been, deemed with a certain sense of representation, deemed to represent, communities and populations.
Large swaths of people.
Yeah, large swaths of people. But the agenda is different from the communities that they're representing.
Right. And I think a lot of that is because if you're up in your ivory tower, you're not in the community.
Right.
Right. So you're coming from a place of privilege and ignorance, and then you come out of that and you are completely disconnected from what's going on.
Yeah.
And what's happening to your fellow man. And I think that highlights sort of maybe what the ivory tower represents, which is, well, in my eyes, right, the ivory tower it's knowledge, but it's also, well, my initial kind of idea of what the ivory tower was like, all right, so there's this, like you were saying the Tower of Babel, was that not a library? Was it? Or no? Okay. I'm not super familiar. I'm not super familiar, but when I thought of it, I thought of like a huge, like a library with all this, not like books and, all this stuff. And to dismantle it, when I thought of that, I thought of like letting all that knowledge spill out to the people, right? I'm not sure if that's necessarily the context. It sounds like maybe it wasn't necessarily what it meant initially, but that's kind of what it's come to mean to me. But it's interesting because this is kind of challenging that for me.
Yeah, and I mean, and again, I think too, for our audience sake, it's fine for us to have this conversation. I mean, that's part of the reason why we're having a podcast, around this concept, because in some instances, what's even coming up for me is, okay, I've been hit with this negative representation of the ivory tower. At the same time, as I'm peering through Professor Chapin's text, I'm like, okay, but is there any level, is this ever a positive You see what I'm saying? Is there ever a positive spin, or is there ever someone defending the need for
an ivory tower?
If that makes sense.
Yeah, it does.
And because to me, even us talking about its antiquated definition versus the modern day and juxtaposing that with the modern day, we're already seeing it's as some folks would say, it's already complicated.
There's a lot to unpack.
There's a lot, right? There is a lot to unpack, but I think that's what's the beauty of our podcast endeavor here is let's unpack that, and let's unpack that in the multiple ways, primarily through the lens of academia.
Sure.
At the same time,
we also need to look at it from the lens of society as a whole.
Yeah. Let's look at it from the lens of society as a whole, because to me, the two interplay with one another,
right.
and I'm already wondering, particularly in the context of academia and particularly in the context of college, higher education, as is generally termed, how is this going to unravel itself, you know, and, how does this term, this figure of speech, juxtapose in the context of higher education? How does it interplay with social justice? How does it interplay with, certain forms of identity that we've been talking about in class? Heck, how does it even interplay with, you can even go so far as say political ideology,
right?
Regardless if you identify as liberal, conservative, regardless of what you identify as, how does it interplay with all of these notions that make up our society, but also make us up individually as well.
Right.
So, still unpacking that, but I also think too, it's also a great question to ask each of our guests. Like, what
does it mean to you?
Yeah. What is our own definition? Because, I feel like in a lot of ways, no matter what is said, we'll be able to find some snippets of similarity, but also some snippets of contrast.
Because it's up for interpretation.
Exactly.
It is. So, so it's definitely, I feel like everybody can bring something new to it. And, because we're here to, the ivory tower, being the figure of speech that it is really representative of a bunch of systems. It's really comprised of all these different systems, and different people with different identities are affected by these systems in different ways. And so when they talk about dismantling the ivory tower, they might be talking about dismantling a different part of it than we are usually. Or they just might bring something to it that we wouldn't have maybe thought of coming from our backgrounds. Right. And so I think that would be important to definitely keep expanding upon.
No, absolutely, and I like the analogy or the metaphor you kind of used, in the sense of, in some respects, it's almost as if, you could even say the ivory tower is made up of different rungs. You were mentioning systems of oppression, and the tower itself could be these different rungs of oppression. Whether it doesn't matter which one is necessarily at the base or at the top. It's just all these rungs. And so some folks might be focusing on this one level, and other folks might be focusing on the level beneath it and the level above it. But if you look at it, I guess from a broader context, everyone's trying to dismantle it at the same time. Right. Which is what is necessary, and even from the context of critical race theory, it's like dismantling one aspect of systemic oppression is not going to dismantle the whole thing.
It's a collaborative process. Like you said, everybody's got to be dismantling their own part.
Yeah. You can't just you know, eradicate racism and then think sexism and homophobia and all, you know, all classism are going to go away. That's not how this works. So
no, not at all. You know, so you have to sort of attack different points.
Exactly, because they all interplay with one another.
Absolutely.
So yeah, but no, I think this is going to be a pretty fascinating read, and you know, if you're okay with it, I think maybe if we can just continue to unpack this particular text. And I actually want to get your thoughts because I just started. Like,
I haven't read that. I haven't read that yet. So
yeah, I just started it. So I was just kind of, like I say, just doing a Google search, just trying to see, well, what is some context here? Mm-hmm. And so I think it's a great way for us to also provide some additional context to our audience also.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think at this point we are going to segue into our interview with Dr. Adrien Bennings, president of PCC. It was a great interview. We really proud of that one. So yeah. Anything you want to say before we dip out of here?
Nah. I think folks will get to know a little bit more about who she is and, you know, her intentions at this institution. And you know, I think people are gonna. I know for us, you know, I'm excited to hopefully invite her back.
Oh, definitely. So. Yeah, definitely. I think we definitely would like to have her back. But yeah, enjoy, guys. Here we go. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Bennings, for coming. It's so great to have you on the show. And we're just going to jump right into the questions because I know we don't have a ton of time. So the first question I want to ask you is sort of, how would you describe your origin story and whatever that means to you? Could you just kind of give us some of your background?
Goodness, my origin story. I like the way you shaped that question. I think it's important to talk about a little bit of where I come from in terms of family and experiences growing up, because that has really shaped who I am today and continues to shape, you know, who I am. So I grew up in a military Christian home, and I was the middle child. I think that right there is a beautiful mix of kind of, you can infer some things that have come to be because of that. You know, my father was military Air Force, and so my home was really structured in a sense of having things a certain way. My dad really brought that military background into the home in terms of not just the structure, but the organization and the routine. And growing up, that was really hard for me. But I think it's important to share in terms of my origin, because that has translated at one point in my time, my life, into an unhealthy way of just having to have everything a certain way. And so if you ever hear me speak, I say I'm a recovering type A. I don't know if you ever fully recover. And excuse me. With type A personalities, it's like you have to have every I dotted and T crossed. You have to know what's going to happen from here to next. Right. So I learned very hard in life growing up that that's not the way life happens. But that was a part of my origin story and growing up and shaping who I was. The other part of the dynamic is I did grow up in a home as a PK, and for those who may not know, I am a preacher's kid, and that came with pressures and expectations and judgments and just a lens of criticism and observation that as a preacher's kid, you know, was something that really heightened my awareness about who I was and behaviors I was able to do or not do. The third factor of my origin story is the middle child. And I was a middle child. My older sister is a year older than me. My baby brother is 5 years younger than me. And that really disrupted my world because I was the baby. And I thought I was the baby. So I had to settle for being the baby girl. And that led me to really, growing up, seek attention, become a daddy's girl, but also to stand out from my siblings. And that led for me to go into competition athletics, you know, and that shaped that role and that journey. And athletics has been core to who I am today in terms of just having that discipline and that competitive drive. But also I had to navigate that as a part of my journey in terms of, you know, the greatest competition is yourself, right? And I had to shift, and even in this professional realm, have to shift from competing not for the performance of people, but competing for the performance of bettering myself, because there's so much of myself that I have to give to others. So that's a snippet of my origin story.
Yeah, no, thank you. That was very, very in-depth. I appreciate it. Well, before we Actually, Dr. Meeks, I think I'm going to take this next question as well, because this is one I formulated. This is just something I was sort of curious about as I was doing a little bit of background on you in preparation for this podcast. I saw that you spent a lot of time at Texas Tech. And I guess I wanted to ask, what made you decide to shift your focus from working at, a large institution like Texas Tech to working at the community college level, and how have you adjusted to that?
Wow, well, Texas Tech is near and dear to me. So as you may know, and through your own experiences, life sometimes has a way of causing you to realign and shift and move forward from one chapter or one season to the next. And so Texas Tech was instrumental for me at a time when I became a single mom. And at the time I was doing professional track and field, I ended up moving back home and pretty much started my journey in higher education at Texas Tech University, eventually starting really full-time as a secretary. And at that time, I had my bachelor's. I had already graduated college and had some time out on my own. But the journey involved me finding myself, but discovering some potential within me to create a career pathway that has brought me here today. But also the grounding factor in that journey at Texas Tech was because of my daughter. I knew that there was a future I would have to create that would be something that was sustainable, but I also wanted to model the way of growth and show her, but also show myself that as a Black woman in higher education, I could be successful. So once my daughter, that journey lasted for several years. I had several iterations of promotions and advancement, but what caused me to shift from a 4-year to a 2-year college, starting with Clovis Community College in New Mexico, I was at another point in time where my daughter, I did not want to move out of the state until my daughter had graduated high school, and I had a stepson and he had already graduated. And I knew that that was going to be my trigger to now explore opportunities outside of Texas Tech. And outside of Texas, primarily because there were, in my mind, limited opportunities that I felt because I was a Black female and could only go so far at the institution. But also I saw that and recognized that there was a timing and a shift of realigning who I was outside of my comfort zones. So I shifted to a community college. Community college is near and dear to me because during the scope of my career, I started college at the age of 16, and I got kicked out the first semester. I was at Texas A&M, and I was like, college, woo, yeah, this is it. What? You got to study? You got to go to class? And so I got kicked out, and community college was my saving grace. I went to Odessa Junior College.
Okay.
Wow.
And so I, prior to working in a community college, I had a personal connection to a community college because there was an opportunity for me when I thought I didn't have any other options. And so Clovis Community College came into the picture, and I was a vice president. And I was like, this is a competition stuff. I was like, you know what? I could be over at college. There's some things that I feel I could pour into every person that comes across the doorways of a community college. And I could shape that in a way that's positive, that's empowering, but also a way that's uplifting and open, and just do it through kindness and love. And so that's how I then shifted further into community colleges as a president with my first presidency at Kellogg Community College in Battle Creek, Michigan.
I love that. That's, I'm sure, very encouraging for any listeners we might have who, are coming into the community college space and might, feel similar to how you did, and look at where you're at now. That's really amazing. All right. Yeah. Well, Dr. Meeks, is there anything?
No, I'm just kind of mapping the connections I had. The Texas connection, I'm definitely interested in exploring. Because I went to school there myself. I went to Prairie View.
Okay.
So, and I told the students, I'm like, that was 5 of the best years of my life. So, and, but I knew I needed to get out. Otherwise I would have. But no, just just mapping out the similarities and just tracking your journey and how inspiring it already is just from what you've shared in the few minutes that you've been with us.
Yeah.
I think a question that I would like to ask is, based on your origin story and the lived experiences you've shared with us, how do you believe that's enabled you to better serve students of color as well as underrepresented students from other marginalized communities?
Sure. I think first, it's important to recognize that I had to come through a process of discovering who I was as a Black woman, but also not limiting myself, because there was a point in time I did, as a victim mentality in terms of the stereotypes or how people viewed me because of what they saw on the outside.
Right.
And so I see myself being able to have, I would say, some principles of growth and development through being a person of color, coming up in, whether that's higher education or any professional realm or any place in this society nationally, bartending, restaurant, athletics, whatever that may look like. My lived experiences, I believe, help shape others and help contribute to my ability to do so, from the standpoint that I recognize each and every person as a human, just as myself, right? And, I've been in spaces where people have said to me, I don't see color, but I'm like, how can you?
Right.
That doesn't
or
exist.
it's I have Black friends.
Yep.
And I had a boss who said, I work with Black people, and so I have these experiences where I believe it's important, first and foremost, to see the whole person.
Absolutely.
And everyone that comes across my presence, or everyone, even when I'm out in the grocery store, this is just my mentality. I look at people and I say they're so precious because there's a purpose in them, whether or not they realize it. And because someone poured into me, or because someone created an opportunity, and because I was able to understand and recognize who I was and the power that I have within me to pour out and influence and create change and dismantle stereotypes and structures, that person has that same power and capability, and they just might need that oomph. They just might need that coach. They just might need that someone who believes in them or who speaks the positive word. That's how I see myself through my own lived experiences, is really modeling, but also really through my words and my actions, being a positive and transformative influencer in such a way that by the time someone leaves my presence, or by the time I leave an organization or institution, it's not better because I was just there. It's better because I dismantled some structures and some systems, and I created a space. And I'll go back to this, in love and in kindness.
Right.
And that's what's missing in our world. If you do it out of love, do what you do out of love. If you see people in love, whether or not you agree with them, that'll dismantle so many biases, so many systems of hate and racism, and even our own personal biases. Because even as a person of color, you have those, right? I'm Black, I don't have any. No, you do, right?
Right.
Okay,
we all do.
Right.
So anyway,
Right.
that's how I see myself through my lived experiences, shaping others, or really creating a transformative impact in the spaces that I step into.
No, that was very powerful. And I definitely appreciate that response, because, I think oftentimes one's lived experiences, it's hard to, it's easy to overlook them and to go back and reflect and pull them to the present. So they become a bit of a superpower to help you be, as you stated, that transformative influencer. And recognizing that, your own lived experiences help shape the identities that you behold, in order to, as you said, and so eloquently stated, so to see the humanity within others, and I definitely appreciate how you keep going back to the concept of love and kindness, because that kind of leads and dismantling out of that context, because that leads to the next question. The title of this podcast is Dismantling the Ivory Tower. And as you stated before we started recording, this can have some level of sensitivity. Folks can kind of get all offended and whatnot and into their feelings, and that's fine. That if that happens, that happens. But I think, to remind our audience that things like this podcast, things like the civil rights movement, or other movements that have instituted change, were done out of love and out of promoting this country to be better. And to me, at least from my own family dynamic, that's what's done. You want somebody to be better because you love them.
Right.
Now, granted, you know the nuance is it's up to them if they want. If they
it goes both ways.
Right, it goes both ways.
Absolutely.
You got to do some work. But for the most part, though, I really appreciate how you come back to that. And so here you are sitting with myself and Elijah on this podcast titled "Dismantling the Ivory Tower." And so, one of the first questions we formulated was, well, what's Dr. Bennings' concept then around the whole ivory tower, and how are some ways she would maybe suggest in the dismantlement of that? So that's our next question to you.
That's a very good question, and the topic is very, very fitting for this time and day and age. I would start with, when I let me change that. When I think about the ivory tower, I think about you can't think about the ivory tower without bringing into the context the history of the ivory tower and
historical connotations.
Exactly, and I think, well, I know that the ivory tower was not created for people of color. The ivory tower was not even created for the empowerment of people of color. The ivory tower was created as a system of privilege and an advancement of people who don't look like us, who at the time, it was deemed, superior to have access to knowledge and access to education, and it was only available to those who were privileged to have it. So I think just kind of shaping it in that historical context, because I started, and this is a part of this context, I became first-time president of Kellogg Community College in 2020. And in 2020, I was the first ever person of color in this position. I was the first Black, and I was the first ever female to hold a presidency at the college. Now, thinking about that, you also have to think about all the other positions and realms and spaces and spheres of influence that we, as in people of color or even Black females, are the first in this day and age.
Right.
That's because of the historical systems that have been set up. And so when you talk about dismantling, there first has to be a self-awareness of, for me, it had to be a self-awareness of myself as an individual to know that even though the system wasn't set up for me initially, even though there were still relevant structures in place that limited my ability to advance or impact because of who I was or what I looked like, I had to shift and become aware that, no, I'm not a victim in this system. I'm a disruptor in this system. Yep. So I call myself, I'm a disruptor, right? And you got to be willing to disrupt through disrupt systems in terms of where you may not have normally been welcome, or they may not normally have been created for you. And that's what I do. So when you talk about dismantling, like tearing down, one of the key things you have to keep in mind is you have to get to the foundation and the root of it, or else you're just building on the same foundation without dismantling the system, and you're just remodeling some walls here or there.
Exactly.
Right. So the ivory tower was not a space created for Black women. It was primarily a space where dominated by white males who not only led institutions but ensured that those systems and structures were in place to their advancement and their benefit. Right. And that still is very relevant today. I'll just say that. And so the self-awareness was one way. You have to start with yourself and going into a space and knowing that you can dismantle these systems and these structures, but you can't go in as a victim. And I couldn't go in as a woe is me, or I always am in this place because I'm Black. Right, because we as Black people, we can focus on that victim mentality in terms of that aspect. But when you start to shift it individually and then collectively, I think that's where you have the greatest opportunity to tear down those strongholds and dismantle those systems. So the self-awareness was one. The other way that dismantling, in my experience and mine, needs to happen and is happening is because now that I'm in these spaces, there was this trendy topic, and it's trendy. I call it trendy because we use diversity, equity, and inclusion.
Mm-hmm.
It's a trend, like, oh, we're doing diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I look at it this way. I'm just going to give you some Dr. B-ism.
Okay.
One of my Dr. B-ism is, if we look at creating systems where everyone has the same opportunity and the access and the support that they need conducive to their individual success, you don't need diversity, equity, inclusion as something separate. It becomes something that is embodied and encompassed in all that you do in policy and practice and structure. However, there is a need, though, because coming up in the educational system as a Black female, even in community colleges, I didn't see anyone who looked like me.
Right.
I didn't see anyone who I could relate to. And even I had a conversation with a student at a luncheon the other day, even in terms of counseling and support. I didn't see anyone I could go to because I didn't think that someone white or someone who didn't look like me or someone who wasn't a Black female could relate to what I was sharing and properly inform me and guide me as a Black female. So there's that piece, diversity, equity, inclusion being embedded, but also having that representation because it's important to our students. It's important. It was important for me. I didn't see very many of me,
Right.
In the president's role. And so I felt that I had to really, I had to work just as hard, even harder to do. And even being in this role, not just at PCC, there are different pressures and expectations that come with being a Black female in this role. And you can perceive, because I perceived that at times you can be held to a higher standard because the standards weren't set for you anyway.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's a greater expectation. So I kind of went around, I talked about self-awareness, I talked about the DEI piece, but I also talked about the representation because representation is so critical, even for me now, even for our students. And, even when my daughter was coming up in college, she needed to see a Black female in terms of counselor or advisor or someone that she could relate to because look at our hospital systems and some of those stories you hear about pregnant Black women who don't get the proper treatment they deserve and have died. We've got to pour into our communities of color. We've got to pour into our populations that can be disadvantaged even in the current systems. So the ivory tower is, when you talk about it in higher education, there's this ivory tower effect that's in politics.
Mm-hmm.
I've been to several capitals and Advocacy Day and Washington, D.C. and different states, and you go in and you see a historical picture of those members who served. And for the longest, you see white males hanging up on the walls in terms of picture. They are the ones who set the policies and the practices and the educational standards long time ago. And those are some of the systems that need to be dismantled because they weren't created for us.
Right.
So anyway, that's my long answer.
It was a great answer.
Great. Yeah.
Really good answer.
Yeah.
You kind of already touched on this next question actually in your last answer, but I am going to ask it anyways, just in case you'd like to elaborate on any of it. So you talked about justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion, and how you feel that integrating all of that into every part of schooling is important. How else are you prioritizing belonging, justice, diversity, equity, and inclusion to support the learning experience of all students at PCC?
So I think it's important to note that coming into a new environment as a new president, still within her first year, it's important for me to continue to get that understanding and context of the current environment. So I'm doing a part of that to understand the dynamic and also understand where we may, which I'm just going to step out and say that I'm going to make the assumption that there are some gaps in terms of our efforts to really align with diversity and equity and inclusion for our students. So the understanding piece is critical for me, and that's primarily where I'm operating at right now. However, that being said, one of the ways too is looking at so my focus right now primarily as well as operations and administration. Where in our policies, where in our practices, do we need to reassess through an equity lens in terms of what's in place that may have a disparate impact for specific populations, underrepresented populations, but also where in our systems and across the the campuses, the district, college-wide, do we need to create those opportunities to bridge, to align with equity in our students in the classrooms, right? You got classrooms, you got spaces like right now I'm in the Multicultural Center. You've got even the people that interact with our students.
Yep.
That's where, if this was videotaped, you'd probably see the faces I'm making, but you have to ensure that the people that are in place also are translating the vision, translating the principles, and translating the message of equity, diversity, and inclusion across all bodies of students that we serve. And sometimes that's not easily done in such an institution so large. So assessing and understanding, but also looking at where we need to make the most immediate changes, but also where can we dive into in terms of really what is the student experience? That's something I need to understand. What is the student experience, especially for our BIPOC, our Black, Indigenous people of color? What does that look like? What are we missing? And the only way to do that is creating the spaces to hear from the students. And I have yet to do that, but that's something that I would be open to doing.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I just wanted to speak to, being a student, a BIPOC student myself, coming here to PCC. There are some spaces which I feel are really, really important and great. And one of those I just want to shout out is Dr. Meek's Men of Color Leadership Program. Already. And the reason that I'm shouting that out is because last year I was struggling with school. I've always had kind of a relationship with school, but I saw an email, or maybe I saw it on the announcements page of PCC that they were recruiting for the Men of Color Leadership Program. And I didn't know anything about it. I don't know, but I decided to look into it. And I'm so glad I did, because here at PCC in that program, I found community. I found people who looked like me, who had experiences like me. The other day I was talking to a brother from the cohort, and he comes up and he talks to me about, he's biracial like I am. And he talks to me about, he asked me, have you ever felt like you don't belong, white side or black side, either side? And I'm like, no one has ever asked me that before, but yeah, I have, and it was cool because it's like, I'm not alone. And it is important to continue creating these spaces because I honestly, if it weren't for that space, I don't know if I'd be here in school right now. I really don't. I might just be still working at a movie theater and just doing that. And so I really think that part is important. And I really appreciate that you seem to see the importance in that. You do see the importance in it. And I respect that, and I appreciate that, and I just want to thank you for that, and thank Dr. Meeks for the opportunity to. No, really, I know you don't. I mean it. So, anyways, that's all. I know we're just about at time.
So how much do I owe you for these comments here?
$5 here and there, if you could just up my pay a little bit, that'd be great. No.
Oh my goodness.
No, but I mean, Elijah's correct in some respects, Dr. Bennings, and definitely love to talk with you more about some of the efforts that are taking place in not just the Multicultural Center, but all the resource centers, all the equity-based centers, identity-based centers, because there are some things we're looking at trying to do collectively. And then, of course, each center has its own, respective, programming and activities and events that they endeavor to do. But I definitely want to say thank you for taking time out of your fantastical busy schedule.
Oh yeah.
I like how you said that.
Yeah, to spend some time with us and to just introduce yourself to our audience. So definitely hope to have you back in the near future.
Sure. Well, I'm excited to join you all, and I was just telling Tia, I was like, oh, I don't want to work today, but this made it worthwhile. There's so many things that make it worthwhile, and I certainly want to follow up on the Men of Color program, and I'm gonna have actually Tia reach out to you because I do want to bring it up as a spotlight, but also bring it before the board, and maybe Elijah invite you to come share your story and success.
I would love to,
but also learn how this program is impacting, the outcomes of our students and the experiences. You spoke to belonging and community, right? But also I hope that maybe I can spend some time maybe with the cohort and talk about what does this mean from you? What do you see the role of the president in terms of supporting or understanding? What is it now that you have my attention that I need to be aware of, So I want to have some dialogue, and we can certainly do that because I'm excited.
I think that would be really awesome, and I think the brothers in the cohort would really appreciate that as well.
Absolutely. So thank you once again, Dr. Bennings, and definitely hope you have a wonderful day. Glad this made it worth it.
It did. Well, thank you all. And I do have to sign off with my, I believe that we're all in this together. I'm just one person. You're just one person. But the greatest things can be accomplished as one together one. And so that's the way I roll. That's the way I move. And that's my life motto.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Bennings.
Awesome.
Appreciate your time.
All right, take care.
All right, guys. I hope you guys enjoyed that interview with Dr. Bennings. Really enlightening stuff. I thought it was great.
Yeah.
We have a couple more guests lined up for the future. I know one of them, we have Dr. Khalid El Hakim. Is that right?
Yeah.
Just make sure I'm pronouncing that right. And he runs the Black History Mobile Museum, which you guys should all go check out. There's a website. I believe it's Black History Mobile Museum 101 or something like that. Maybe just Black History Mobile Museum.
Yeah, I think it's BH101mm.
There it is.
.com.
BH101mm.com. So go check that out. We're looking forward to talking to him about that, and also celebrating the 50th anniversary of hip hop, which is this year. So we're going to be doing an episode on that. We might be asking for some input from you guys on what your favorite hip hop albums, artists, songs, all of it, and how that's impacted you, especially while you've been maybe here at PCC.
Yeah. And for our audience who may not be affiliated with PCC, just, just how hip hop in and of itself has helped you navigate through life in general.
Definitely.
And, it's a beacon of hope for some, and it's been a lifeline for others. And I think it's definitely been a messenger of the people, since its inception. And to me, that's what makes, that particular genre of music so powerful.
Definitely.
And, as we talked about, as we alluded to in class a couple of times, hip hop in and of itself has its own culture. And to me, the aspects of hip hop culture can definitely be used to help dismantle the Ivory Tower as well.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And we will get into that.
Absolutely. I'm looking forward to it.
Me too. All right. Everybody, we'll see you next episode.
Peace, everyone.
Peace.